and welcome to our Knowing Wildcats Week 3, where we will discuss pumas, land use changes, and what those mean for wildcats and their prey, especially at the urban-wildland interface. We're also going to touch on the impacts of land use change on human-wildlife conflict, specifically pumas here. I want to introduce Dave Stoner, who will be presenting today. Dave is a colleague, partner, and a friend, and an all-round skilled scientist who's actually looking to answer some of the most pressing and relevant questions around in situ pumas and what the future holds. Regarding Western states where he works, as well as in the Bay Area, where Dave has been involved with the Bay Area Puma Project as a co-PI since 2011. Dave has degrees from UC Berkeley and Utah State, where he did his graduate work. And he has worked on pumas and their major prey species in Utah and California since 1996. In addition to pumas, Dave is also working on research projects related to sage grouse, wild horses, and mule deer. He has a strong interest in integrating satellite imagery with field data to map habitat and urban sprawl. So I, again, am Zara McDonald, your host and the president of Felidae Fund, and we welcome you to this webinar today, and I'm gonna ask Dave to get started. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Zara. Thanks for having me, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. The subject of today's talk is really germane to a lot of wildlife management and land use planning that's happening all over the world. Really, this is a global phenomenon, and we're in a phase of history that's unprecedented at many levels, with human beings modifying the surface of the earth at extraordinary rates, and animals reacting to these changes. And so our questions really boil down to what are the responses, beyond hearsay and supposition. What are these animals doing in urban areas? How are they reacting to it? And how does it affect their survival and conservation status? And we're focusing on pumas and their major prey item, mule deer. That is, these two species interact over all of North America, and though pumas eat many things, the mule deer really has a special place in its natural history. And so I'd like to start out with a little background. This is a graph of human population abundance over the last several thousand years, and really all we have to do is focus in on the far right end of the curve, where we see that coincident with the Industrial Revolution, human populations increased sevenfold over the last 200 years. And what this has done has been, in the wake of agricultural development, has allowed numbers to increase, and in the wake of that, land use change, not just agriculture, but urbanization, as this map shows of the United States, that people are everywhere, and this is changing the face of these ecosystems and the way animals interact. And so behind this, there's also another phenomenon, and I'm not going to touch on this too much tonight, but climate change. And in North America, Western North America, what we see, what the observations indicate and the projections allude to, is warming and drying, and that this is strongly influential in plant communities, and how which have ramifications up through higher trophic levels. So as I say, this won't be a focus of tonight's talk, but it's something to keep in mind that is occurring in the background, is this warming and drying trend that affects plant communities. And so while the drought may be over for now, the projections are that they will get stronger, in magnitude and longer in duration. And so these are problems that we're going to be faced with for the coming decades. So as an intro, to recap, we have three phenomena. We have more people on the land, we have less open space, and we have lower ecosystem productivity as a function of climatic changes. And all of these interact in ways to strongly influence how animals behave, what their distributions are, and how their populations may fluctuate.
Dave, can I interrupt you for just a second? I want to just tell
Yes.
everyone that we welcome your questions in the Q&A, and we'll address those at the end. I forgot to mention that at the beginning, and I just want to make that announcement now. And chat is open as well, just for saying hello to us, but Q&A for the questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. We really welcome the input and are excited to talk to you about this. All of this boils down to the anthropogenic planet. The planet is a reflection of our own activities, our own energy expenditures, and what I will argue, and sort of the working hypothesis that we're working with here, is that species able to adapt to human activities are the ones that are going to persist and will drive ecological interactions in the future. And just as an example here, what you're seeing in green are the road networks globally. So we have a very large footprint on the planet. Where does that leave us? We have increasingly seen more and more wildlife in urban areas and on the fringes. And though we may have the assumption that animals are not interested in being around people, they are, and there are two problems that stem from this, and these problems are interwoven. The first one, the more pressing, that is getting a lot of media attention, are conflicts between people and wildlife, as exemplified in these images. We have pumas in people's backyards. We have debates in some of the eastern states about how to deal with overabundant deer populations and the problems that ensue from that. In other parts of the world, we have human safety concerns, and well, we have them here as well. And then this image in the upper right is of an animal being translocated from Reno after it walked right through the front door of Harrah's Casino about 8 or 9 years ago. So all of these things are occurring, and we think of them as odd and piecemeal and just aberrations, but what I'm going to argue is that these are actually part of a larger trend, that this concrete wave we're referring to of land use change and urbanization is creating a lot of opportunities for species that are tolerant of human activity to some degree or another, but those opportunities come with costs. So our second problem that stems from this is, and this is one that from a conservation standpoint we tend to focus on because of its larger scale implications, is the loss of habitat and the fragmentation of remaining habitats. Now this map that I'm illustrating is of a migratory deer that we collared west of Salt Lake City several years ago, and I'll zoom in on some of these spots where this animal is moving. And each color refers to a different deer, and the area in between these mountains is an area of rapid urban growth. So this is where the open space is, people commuting into the larger cities for jobs, and there's a lot of private land, and it's rapidly developing, and historically deer have been migrating through this. Here's another example. Now, this image is almost 10 years old, and in the time, the intervening time, all of what you see underneath those telemetry points is filled in. So the severing of migratory routes is another phenomenon related to land use change and human activities that it's receiving a tremendous amount of attention and federal support, particularly in the western states, where we still have a lot of big game populations that that have to move in response to seasonal changes. This is interpreted as snowpack. Perhaps not the same concern in coastal California, but in much of the Mountain West, animals move in response to deep snow buildup, and migration routes. Maintaining those are critical for conserving some of these populations. So these are our two problems: conflicts and habitat loss. And of course, this is when we come full circle. Animals moving through urban areas create problems for people. Well, it's easy to look at this and say, you know, what's the problem? Is this really something that we as a society need to be concerned about? And so I really appreciated Courtney's references 2 weeks ago to the ecosystem services that we derive from Pumas specifically. And I want to add something to that. This may seem a bit vulgar to put it in these terms, but there are financial costs and benefits associated with these animals. And right now I'm speaking about wildlife broadly, not just pumas and deer, but we can enumerate these. So our three major sources of conflict and cost associated with wildlife are agricultural depredations, property damage, and human safety. And by human safety, much of that has to do with automobile collisions. And these tally up to somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 billion a year in the United States. Here are some examples, but importantly, there are tremendous benefits that come from wildlife in the various forms of recreation. And this includes hunting, fishing, photography, bird watching, any kind of recreational activity centered on wildlife. And the benefits, the financial benefits of these activities far exceed the costs and have been calculated to support something on the order of well over 500,000 jobs in the United States. And to take that even further, almost 1% of the gross domestic product in the United States can be traced back to some kind of wildlife related activities. So conservation of these animals is extremely important, and in hypothetical ways, in the ways of ecosystem function, but also in terms of the day-to-day prosperity of people. There is a tremendous benefit to having these animals in our lives and on our landscapes. So
Hey,
here's
Dave,
what we know. Yes.
Dave, let me, sorry. So we've had a couple people ask if you could move your mic slightly away from your mouth. We're getting a little bit of muffle. Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks.
Here's what we know about the phenomenon. Really, habitat fragmentation and loss are the major problems at the population scale. So while the conflict can be dealt with on an individual or case-by-case basis, but when we lose these migratory routes and we have outright loss of habitat, that is really where we risk losing whole populations. And this is going to be the challenge for us as a society and for our management agencies in the coming century. Now, among wildlife, those that are large-bodied, like our focal critters here tonight, are really at the greatest risk. They're at the greatest risk because they have high caloric demands, which means they are wide-ranging. They use a lot of space. And they're high-profile animals. For better or for worse, people pay a lot of attention to pumas and deer. And it covers the gamut, but they capture our attention in ways that many other species do not. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, for just a moment, I want to step back and insert a little basic ecology here. This is the foundation of why pumas particularly require so much space. Is if we think of the energy coming in from the sun, the ultimate source of energy, plants capture roughly 2% of that, which I've illustrated as the green bar here at the bottom. Plants are converting about 2% of solar energy into biomass that can be consumed by herbivores. And about 10% of that plant biomass is converted into herbivore biomass. Herbivores are eaten by carnivores, another 10%, etc. So the point here is that we are losing energy from ecosystems at an exponential rate. Only about 10% is proceeding from one trophic level to another. So if we think of plants as being the basis of the system, plants are responding to variation in precipitation on an annual basis. And so during our big El Nino years, we have big winters, lots of rain and snow. And what this equates to is a surge in productivity. And in the mule deer, our focal herbivore here, that's reflected in their productivity. So we see big fawn crops in the wake of wet years. This goes up the food chain. The puma relies quite heavily on fawns as a food resource, and so the changes or the reverberations in the vegetative layer move up through the system. Now we have drought as well, a dry year, and that is when we see crashes in cohorts and much smaller fawn crops. So keep this general relationship in mind as we go through this. It's really important, and it's the reason that small changes or subtle changes at the bottom result in very proportionately large changes at the highest trophic levels, such as with our top carnivores. Now, as an example of this, I overlaid 2 home ranges of male pumas on this map. The one here in southern Utah is about just shy of 400 square kilometers. This is pretty typical, unexceptional. Some are smaller, but for a male, this is about what they require. Now, if we look at this one straddling the Nevada-California state line, it's 6,500 square kilometers. This is probably the largest male home range ever documented. And keep in mind, a male home range captures a demographic unit, and that unit is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of half a dozen adult females, a few transients, and some kittens. So when we look at these, that tells us something about the number of animals in those places. And again, the numbers are small at the top. And what's striking about this is these are just 2 individuals whose spatial requirements are visible at the scale of the southwestern United States. So keep that in mind as we move through some of this material and talk about habitat fragmentation, particularly in the Bay Area. So on that subject, I want to leave you with this quote from E.O. Wilson, and I think this really nicely summarizes the ecological phenomenon here and the challenges we're faced with. He said, top carnivores are predestined by their perch at the apex of the food web to be big in size and sparse in numbers. They live on such a small portion of life's available energy as to always skirt the edge of extinction. And they're the first to suffer when the ecosystem around them starts to erode. Now, that's what we're facing with land use change, an erosion of the ecosystem, or at least a radical restructuring of it. So, with that in mind, we can ask the question, we've seen on the news animals showing up in peculiar places. Our puma that was in Harrah's Casino, what in the world are they doing there? And in short, it's about food. Ultimately, it is about food. Some of them may have run off course and their compass went kittywampus, but by and large, they're there because they're abundant and predictable food resources. And I highlight predictable because that really is the key here. In these dynamic environments where these wild ecosystems are fluctuating seasonally and then interannually with drought and wet years, cities are constant. So if you're a carnivore or an omnivore, we have garbage in abundance, and that's put out at regular intervals. And there's a whole literature on black bears and garbage that is evolving here, and the effects are stunning. We're not talking about bears tonight, so I will leave that for another day. We also have roadkill. Again, it's very predictable in space. Going to be carcasses along these long linear strips, and the animals recognize this availability. If you're an herbivore in a mountainous area, we have snow removal in the wintertime. Snow, it is extremely energetically consumptive to walk through snow. And then the roads are salted as well. So there's a real attraction here. And then what I've saved for last, what I think is the biggie here, is this, irrigation. Now, it's something we see in our front yards and around town all summer long. And this simple change, I would argue, has led to some of the real, the biggest changes in terms of animal behavior and attraction to urban areas or urban interface environments. So with that, I want to show you an example from a ranch not far from me. I'm here in northern Utah, and back in the 40s, the state purchased a ranch, and the objective was to try and prevent elk from migrating into the valley during the wintertime because of the damage to crops. And so they purchase this area as a winter range. They grow crops in the summer and they feed elk all winter long. The graph on the left shows you the phenological curve of this little pixel here. We'll call it the native range. So these are measurements taken from a satellite, and this is just showing how plants grow in the spring and summer. They hit some peak in the middle of summer, fall comes, and they taper off. Now, if we take the identical measurement from this irrigated patch, this is what it looks like. So notice the magnitude is greater, the duration of the growing season is greater. And we can measure the difference between these two, and that tells us, that gives us a sense of the total biomass difference in terms of forage available. So I want you to think of this in terms of, why are deer coming into town? You know, why are they going after gardens and lawns when there's plenty of open space? Well, this is why. Now in the Bay Area, there are deer that live their entire lives in the urban areas, but elsewhere it's a seasonal phenomenon. As the forage in the wildlands dries out or is depleted, they shift over to these irrigated environments. Let's look at another example. This is a golf course just outside of Las Vegas. Las Vegas, this area has a lot of bighorn sheep. A bighorn is an herbivore adapted to low water environments. Now imagine you're a bighorn, you live out here, and you come over the hill, and this is what you find. You've been eating woody browse, and you see water and a lot of very succulent forage. This is a huge attraction. So big that it's even moved up the food chain, where this golf course in Phoenix, this family of pumas was sighted there. So when I say it's all relative, I mean the gradient of productivity between a wildland environment and our cultivated environments. Again, the grass, the golf course is irrigated through the summer, it's constant. Here's some data. These are data from nearby city park collected by a colleague of mine with the U.S. Geological Survey. Now the graph in the lower left is the sheep counted in this park throughout the year. You'll see none of them are there in January, but as we get into June, suddenly the numbers are huge. And then as the weather cools, they taper off. So they're there in the summertime. Now, what they did to follow up with this is they looked at what's called the lamb-to-ewe ratio. And this is a common metric many wildlife managers use to estimate productivity of a population. And this red line represents how lamb production goes up with increasing precipitation. So the heavier rains you get in November leads to bigger green up in the late winter and spring, and therefore more food, and therefore more surviving lambs. This blue line represents the herd that uses this city park, and note that it is flat. It doesn't matter how much rain comes, they have forage all year long. So their population dynamics have been disconnected or decoupled from the native range that they have inhabited for thousands of years. So this is the draw, and it's got real benefits to these animals. If they use the park, there's plenty to eat. There's shade here. It's a very productive environment for them. So I'll say urban environments offer a cornucopia for deer and other ungulates. And in this cornucopia really amounts to food availability and abundance. But as I alluded to earlier, there's a cost. These environments can be very dangerous. And so this is what they're faced with when they decide to exploit these environments, are risks that they aren't faced with in the wildland environments: fences, dogs, and automobiles, all of which can take a toll. Okay, so that's a little something about deer. Again, I focus on deer and to some extent sheep to illustrate how these herbivores, they're a lower trophic level, they're tied to the plants, and as the plants fluctuate through time and space, the population dynamics of these animals tracks that. But we're interested in the top carnivore in the system, the puma. How do these changes affect them? What are their reactions? So I'd like to start with a conception that many people hold, which is that aren't these animals afraid of humans? When humans come in, don't they leave the area temporarily or permanently? And I'm going to show you an example of one of our animals that we tracked for many years on the south end of the Salt Lake Valley. Now, in this image, what you see is the adult female poking her head out of a culvert. The star behind her is a reference point. You'll see it in every image that follows. So that is the same place in every picture. Here she is leaving the culvert in the morning. Here she is on another evening, a foggy night. The eyes here are her kitten looking at her as she leaves. This is what it looks like from that culvert. This is what she's going out into. There's a commuter highway here. There's an underpass. And this is on a military base where I did much of my research. So it's got a lot of open space and wildlands, but it's right on the edge of the greater Salt Lake metro area. So there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people, a lot of development. So you might say, she's got hundreds of square kilometers to set up a den. Why in the world would she be here? What's the appeal of this particular spot? And this is the answer. It's right along a major commuter highway, which is littered with roadkill deer. A little more on that momentarily. Here's another example. This is about 10 miles to the north on the Kennecott copper mine. And this is back from the days when we were just putting GPS collars on these animals, and we really didn't know a whole lot about what they were doing in the wee hours. So what we see are points in the evening, progressively making her way closer to town. What's in town is this. It's a cemetery. In the cemetery, in ag fields across the road, there's a lot of food. The deer come down at night. She's down feeding on roadkill deer. And then as the sun rose, she would make her way back up and then bed up in the forest. So we've documented this on numerous occasions. The animals still living in wild lands, but capitalizing on resources associated with human activity. So here's some data to get your blood pumping. The graph on the left demonstrates the age of our study animals when they died, split by gender. What you see here are females, and so the gray bars represent animals that died on the urban wildland interface. The white bars represent all mortalities combined. And what should strike you is that those that died on the urban interface were all old. Now, 11 years old for a puma that's the end of the road. They don't get a whole lot older than that. They're developing arthritis and have dental problems at that point. Over here for the males, it's just the opposite. They're young animals. And in this case, one was blind, the other was starving to death. These are the individuals that are coming into town to capitalize on food resources there. So the simplistic model is that dental wear catches up with them in old age. And for the females, they can continue to breed all the way to the end. They have no reproductive senescence that we know of. So you've got older females whose ability to hunt is compromised by poor dentition, and then they've got a family to support. So they're at these incredibly high energetic demands on them, either to lactate or to feed the kittens directly. And so it prompts them to capitalize on what we're calling safe food. It's safe because catching live deer is a dangerous business. But in so doing, there are other risks. So this map just shows a deer icon at every mile marker where roadkill have been picked up. So notice that it's the entire east side of this range. Why? Because there's ag land here and there's snow here. So the animals are continually crossing the road as commuters are heading into Salt Lake at the crepuscular time of day when deer are active. So it's just a meat grinder. It's producing a lot of dead animals that are easy to pick up. So the poorest hunters are the ones that are using the urban interface environments most readily. Okay, so again, it's a cornucopia. We've got pets, livestock, we've got garbage and the animals attracted to it. We've got our native prey that are there very predictably, but again, there are risks that these animals are faced with in exploiting these environments. And so from the conservation standpoint, the question is, to what extent are these mortalities additive to the mortality in the population? Are these urban interface populations that have so much food actually declining because mortality is high? And there's some evidence to suggest that is the case, though it's highly variable. Okay, let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about some of the work I've been involved with NASA using satellite imagery to map sky glow and nighttime lights. And this gets a little funny, but again, we're going back to the question of, are pumas afraid of people? And I hope by this point you're saying, well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, yes and no. And this further supports these arguments. These are data from 2 to 3 populations that we categorized as wilderness, meaning pure dark, no sky glow, no city lights, or the urban interface. So like my old study site on the edge of Salt Lake City with a tremendous amount of light pollution. And so we have pumas on the left and deer on the right. We had more data for deer, that's why there are more graphs here. But what you're looking at here is that as light increases, here's how the deer are responding to it. More light, more attraction to well-lit areas on the urban interface. In these urban interface populations, they are drawn to the light. Now in these rural, what I'm calling rural or wilderness populations, they have the opposite reaction. The deer going to the darkest areas. The pumas, they track this to some degree, but not as strongly. So the wildland pumas or the wilderness pumas are again going for the darkest areas. They're tracking their prey. In these urban interface areas, they're not so sure. So what it looks like is the pumas don't really like the light, but they know that's where the deer are, so they're getting as close as they can. This is a funny graph, but again, we have our three types of environments. 0 means no selection. So that's we really aren't reacting to light. Here, this is their reactions to light. So what this is showing is that as light increases, these urban interface animals are avoiding it to the extent that they can. This is pumas only now. This is contrasted with the classic view that pumas hunt edge environments. So they like ecotones or transitions. And in these more wildland environments, that's what we see. Low light levels, they are closer to the edge. Whereas in the urban interface, they're going into the forest interior, into these darker areas. So we see real differences in the behavior of the animals based on the amount of ambient light. So when there's a lot of light, they seek the dark. When there's not a lot of light, they're going into the forest interior. This is what it looks like spatially. So this study was done across the Great Basin. Our two big cities were Reno and Salt Lake. These green dots represent cache sites. So these are places where the pumas have killed a deer and come back to feed on it over multiple days. Notice it forms almost a donut around downtown Reno. Notice also that in the wildest, darkest areas, there's not a lot of activity. We'll come back to that in a moment. Same with the Salt Lake area. They're not in the light, but they're not too far from it. And so what you should take away from this is that there's a lot happening just where the shadows begin on the edge of these cities. There's a lot of nature happening, including predation. Okay, so I want to reference back to some results that Courtney discussed 2 weeks ago on body condition and wrap that into this. What she said and what we found in this paper was that pumas exhibiting the best body condition measured through photographs were not those in the urban interface, nor were they in the wilderness areas, but in areas that we call intermediate disturbance, such as vineyards, city parks, and cemeteries. So, in other words, pumas that had access to those kinds of land uses tended to be in better condition. Now let's go back to the graph I showed you about mortalities up here. Who's using the more strongly urban areas? It's these young males that don't know how to hunt. So they're in poor condition. They're going in there to try and scavenge food. And then these animals in the wilderness areas they're riding they're living off the land. So when it dries up, there's not as much food, so they fluctuate to a greater degree. This fits with our running hypothesis that these urban environments or urban interface environments offer a strange mix of benefits and costs. More food, more danger. Okay, something we're getting into in the coming year are trying to estimate extirpation thresholds. And by extirpation, all I mean is the loss of a local population. And so our questions are, at what point does fragmentation prevent movement? This is going back to the fragmentation or habitat, the chopping up of large blocks of habitat through road development, largely. And then, how much space is required to support a puma population? And think back to the graph that I showed you earlier, the map of the home ranges. These animals need an awful lot of space. And so we have the advantage of being able to look at pumas and deer from a range of environments, from where I worked in Utah and some what we'll call wilderness area or very open space and not a lot of congestion. We worked with some people in Arizona around Flagstaff, a bigger city, growing, and then some of the images I showed you from around Salt Lake. Now we've got a bona fide city here, and then of course the Bay Area, which is an urban area at global proportions. So our question is, how small is too small? In other words, when a habitat patch is isolated, what what can it support? And we have two questions related to that. One is going back to conflict and the probability of conflict with people, and the other is related to patch size. And so what you see here is a hypothetical puma population comprised of 7 individuals. And in this example, 6 out of the 7 have home ranges that are brushing up against some other kind of habitat, in this case, probably an urban environment. So the likelihood is that all of these animals on the edge are going to be utilizing those food resources. And so what we're measuring is the perimeter to area ratio under the hypothesis that at some point there's a threshold at which there's simply too much edge for any puma to survive without capitalizing on those non-traditional food resources, be it pets or garbage or roadkill. The second part of this is looking at these remnant habitat patches in and around the Bay Area. So this is the Bay here, and we've got some very large ones that are in good shape, but there are a lot of others of varying sizes. And the question here is, at what point is the habitat simply too small to support a puma population, however we define a population? So this is work that we're getting into right now and is forthcoming or underway over the next year. Okay, so some of the things that we need to consider is, well, how much space do these animals need? So these are some data showing the size of home ranges as a function of NDVI, and NDVI is just a satellite-derived measure of greenness. So it's an index of how productive or lush the environment is. And as we would expect, those animals in desert environments have the largest home ranges, and those in the most productive environments have relatively small home ranges. So this is a visual. Those animals in the Mojave Desert are they've got to cover a lot of ground in order to make a living, whereas those in these other environments, this is the Ochre Mountains in central Utah, are relatively lush and more productive and have higher prey populations. These are 2 home ranges of an adult female in these 2 environments. These are on the same scale. This is what it takes to make a living in southern Nevada, and this is what it takes to make a living in central Utah. And this all boils down to prey density, how much food is available in these environments. So the next question is, how much deer does it take to support a puma? And we have 2 ways of looking at that. We've measured the puma to deer ratio across space, meaning many states, many different environments ranging from dry to wet. And what we found was that puma abundance tracks deer abundance. I mean, these lines are perfectly parallel. And we were really excited about this result because what it says is that although the density of animals changes as the environment changes, the ratio of deer to pumas remains constant. Now, what we all know, populations fluctuate in time. They go up and they go down. So these are data from a study done in Eastern California. This is where I cut my teeth in the cougar business many years ago. And that was a single population that we monitored for 20 years. And what we found was that the puma to deer ratio varied from 1 puma per 167 deer. This is very tight. And then at another point, it was 1 per 2,000. And the average overall of this was about 1 per 790 deer. So you see these are dramatically different. There are different sampling methods, but what I want you to take away from this is it takes a lot of deer to support 1 puma. And when I say support, I don't mean that it eats that many deer on an annual basis, but you need to have a population of that size to produce enough fawns and have enough animals getting into the older age classes where they're vulnerable to predation. So that's the kind of resources it takes to support a large obligate carnivore. Well, okay, we're just passing the buck here. How much space is required to support 370 deer? That's the question. Well, I hope you're not surprised. Deer abundance varies with the productivity of the environment. Now we're talking about direct measures of vegetation. So a deer is a strict herbivore. The more plants you have, the more deer you have. Here are our study sites showing examples of the most productive and to the least productive. But based on these, in order, the space that's required to support 370 deer is this. In a good environment, somewhere around 60 square kilometers. In a more impoverished environment, up to 1,500. These are the kind of values we have to keep in mind when we're making plans for conserving these large animals in highly fragmented environments where space is a premium. Okay, a couple points that I want to leave you with. The economics of wildlife management. And all I mean by this is that, think back to the benefits of having wildlife. They have, it's quantifiable. We value them. We value these animals for many reasons. And the cost of management is quite cheap when habitat is intact and when it's healthy. As degradation increases, we have fragmentation, we have loss, we may have the introduction of exotic plants. All these things make management far more expensive. And unlike the image I have in front of you, it's a nonlinear relationship. So an example from Southern California that's demanded a lot of media attention in the last few years are the Santa Monica Mountains. This population is completely isolated by urbanization. They are quite literally between the devil and the deep blue sea. What isn't bounded by houses is bounded by the ocean. The solution is to build an overpass that you see in the center of the image here to increase connectivity with larger puma populations, so to allow this population to persist. The price tag on this, seatbelt yourself into your chair here. This is no joke. Now this figure may not be entirely accurate. My understanding is it's a moving target, but suffice to say it's in the many tens of millions of dollars to mitigate this isolation caused by urban sprawl. And then even if that is successful, here's what we're looking at. This is the population here. The outlying problems that these animals are faced with are simply not going anywhere. This is what you would call a triage situation. Big animals in a small space with an awful lot of people around. And moreover, the conflicts, these animals are all utilizing human subsidies to their diet. Again, the roadkill, the garbage, the pets, etc. These are tough situations. To the extent that they can be avoided, that's ideal. But in this case, it's triage. Okay, I'm going to leave you with these thoughts. I am optimistic, but it's important to recognize the interaction of animal behavior with these land use changes. So historically, this is your puma hunting habitat. They'd be using drainages that are well forested, and as the summer progressed and the grasses dried, all the animals would be drawn into these relatively moist spots. Now we have this massive interface, and they're in the desiccated grasses looking down and saying, wow, there's water, there's succulent vegetation. I'm not going to sit up here in the hills and get baked by the sun. I'm going to the suburbs. And so these problems are with us. And again, cities offer a lot of attractive resources for wildlife. And that's just not going away. The conflicts that stem from this will be part of urban wildlife management as long as cities exist. It's also important to recognize human tolerance really varies, and wherever a community is on the spectrum from left to right, conflicts often have real emotional or financial implications or repercussions. And so people's attitudes vary, and that can make this very difficult. Managing these conflicts is extraordinary. And again, as the habitat is lost, management just becomes prohibitively expensive. So with that, I'm gonna
Great.
shut down and take questions if there are any. Thank you for your time and attention.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I think what we're going to do, we're probably going to run over just a little bit. So for those of you who can't stick around for an extra 5 or 10 so we can get to the questions and get them answered, we will have a recording of this webinar that can circulate in the next 24 hours. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I have other esteemed colleagues with me here, Courtney, Ginger, and Kat, and they're all going to dive in and help. Actually, I think Ginger's going to read some of the questions for us, and Courtney's helping answer some of those in the Q&A window. So, Ginger, do you want to start with the first? Great.
Why don't I start with Richard? What are your thoughts about the importance of sport hunting on wildlife conservation?
Okay, given that we have only a few minutes and I could have done an entire webinar on that topic, I'm gonna make it very brief. Richard just recognized there's tremendous nuance and complexity in that question. Sport hunting of any species, but particularly with the pumas, maybe it's something that elicits a lot of emotional reactions. But it's important to recognize that what it does is it provides a political center. So debates around carnivore management tend to be polarized between agricultural interests and animal preservationists. Offering a hunt buys a lot of, it buys a seat at the table for a more moderate voice, and hunting pumas occurs in all the western states with the exception of California. The species has incredibly robust reproductive the reproductive biology of these cats is stunning. They can recover. The challenges remain with good sustainable hunting management are estimating abundance and mortality rates, and going back to the theme of spatial requirements. There's tremendous movement within these populations, and that really makes counting these animals difficult. So hunting provides a political center. It is sustainable if done properly. It's extremely contentious. I actually wrote a paper on that subject. If you're interested, I can provide it through Felidae.
Okay, next from Christine, are there any benefits of pumas spending more time in urban areas?
To the animals themselves, I think that's an open question. So as I tried to make clear, there are resources there that could result in greater kitten production. And in ecology, that's how we measure success or benefit. Is there some increase in productivity that would not be there otherwise? The problem is these urban environments can be quite dangerous. There are a lot of animals hit by cars and removed for human safety concerns and things like that. So the answer is I don't have a good straight answer for you, other than to say they are attractive, and whether we see higher kitten survival in urban areas versus wild areas, it probably fluctuates quite dramatically depending on the outlying conditions. In other words, during a drought, the urban animals are probably doing better than their wildland counterparts.
Okay. Roger is asking, Dave, are there any successful programs across the Western states to reimburse ranchers or hobby animal owners for documented and confirmed stock losses due to puma?
Great question. That is a subject I don't know a whole lot about. Many states do have compensation programs. I think it varies highly from one state to another. I have a colleague who's conducting a study, and the question is, what's the ratio? Meaning the state has been reimbursing ranchers for lost stock at a 1-to-1 ratio. And what I'm talking about here, more open range grazing allotments where the sheep or cattle are on national forest lands. But we know pumas tend to go through what's called surplus killing, where they'll go into a sheep herd and they'll kill a dozen animals. And then they hide their prey. So 1-to-1 may, the question is, of all the sheep that you find, how many actually were depredated? And that's an open question. It demands some more research, but the short answer to your question is it varies by state, and there are compensation programs to some degree or another.
Okay. Liz asks, what challenges do you expect pumas to face once shelter in places are lifted?
Oof. Well, more people in the woods. And so I think Courtney alluded to this 2 weeks ago, in that you have causes of mortality outside of what we know about. I mean, we can count the animals that are hit by cars, and we know in hunting states it's pretty well enumerated, the animals that are removed through hunting. But you also have a lot of poaching, and you have accidents. So there's illegal snaring, something that we've seen occasionally, are people that put up foot and neck snares to keep pumas out of sheep. And so I suspect that anytime you have more human activity in the woods or in the habitat, the potential for interactions, potentially lethal interactions, increases.
Okay. Another question, can you speak to recent developments to give pumas endangered species protection for some populations in California? Please.
Yeah. Well, I can allude to it. I'm a little distant from it, but those last slides I showed you of the Santa Anas and the Santa Monica Mountains, those are really the flagship populations for that movement to give them an endangered or a legal status that would provide more protection, because there are very few animals. The image I showed of the bridge, that population has, I think, 6 adults. Maybe it fluctuates up to 8 or 10, but there are very few. And so those are the populations that are driving some of that policy. And from what I understand, what has historically been the case is that pumas in those populations that got into livestock or eating pets were potentially removed for depredation. And with this change in policy, there's going to be a stronger, a legal mandate to use non-lethal tools to deal with depredations and put more onus on landowners to protect their animals. So I think that's what's driving it, is that the Santa Monicas just cannot handle any mortality. There's so few animals there that they really fit the criteria of being vulnerable to extirpation.
So we're going to have to sort of do some super quick answers just so we can get through the rest. We have about 9 questions. We may not get to all of them.
Okay.
But if you could truncate your response as much as possible while trying to answer the question, it might enable us to get through them.
Okay.
So here's a quickie. Should cities be building up before out to help prevent further fragmentation? That's Brittany.
Yes.
The quickie.
High density.
Yeah. And is the mortality threat as high in rural areas, which you mentioned harbor healthy pumas? So in the modest development areas, could this immediate disturbance help in conservation efforts?
Oof, that's a good question. I don't know. I think that's an open-ended question that requires more research.
Have you registered the consumption of garbage such as plastic, thread, etc., in peri-urban environments?
I have not. I've heard a lot of stories from managers about pumas and garbage, but in terms of finding those kinds of food items in scat or stomach samples that I've looked at, I have not found any plastic or aluminum or anything.
Okay. Do you recommend taking measures other than putting in overpasses or biological corridors in order to create corridors?
Well, overpasses and underpasses are the most expensive. They're also the most effective. I don't know that there are a whole lot of options for those populations such as the Santa Anas where they are completely isolated. I think the name of the game here is to be more proactive in seeing this coming and work with agencies like Caltrans to try and prevent isolation to begin with is really what we should be striving for.
So anticipating the growth and working to make sure isolation doesn't occur.
Yes, yeah.
In the future growth.
Yeah, because once it does, it's pretty hard to re-engineer.
Okay, let's see. Could you further, this is from Chloe, could you further explain the differences between males and females going after safe prey? If I remember correctly, the graph, it seemed to suggest the males go after safer prey less often, and if so, why?
Okay, I put it this way: the females have a job to do. That's to see their kittens survive into adulthood. As such, they have a very conservative strategy. They know their home ranges extremely well, and so they focus their feeding efforts on animals that are abundant and safe to handle, namely fawns. Males like, well, I won't editorialize. Males are all over the map. They take whatever comes. Think of the organic eater versus the person who goes to fast food restaurants at the bottom of an off ramp. The males will eat anything, absolutely anything, and are far more risk prone in their hunting habits. I mean, all of the bull elk that I picked up in the field were killed by males, every single one of them. So yes, radically different, much like other mammals.
Okay, Mauro Lucerini asks, is the huge cost of protecting these pumas worth the benefits?
Well, every individual has to decide that for themselves. I would argue that 87 million would go a long ways toward protecting pumas were it spread out across the state where we have large populations that still we can get ahead of the problem. So I will leave that up to the listener to decide for themselves.
Quickie, is the paper about pumas and deer responses to light still under review?
Still under review. Stay tuned. It's been an uphill battle, but I think we should see it come to the light, so to speak, later this year.
And I think we got them all.
Did you get the last two?
Yeah, I think we answered those before.
Okay. All right. Well, then I guess we're going to let everyone go at this point. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you have questions, certainly reach out. And the recording again will be available within 24 hours or so, a little bit after that. And we enjoyed having you, Dave, today. And hopefully people can join us next week when we'll have Christian from Chile. So we'll be talking about pumas again. All right, have a wonderful evening and stay safe, everyone.